There are words we repeat without thinking, phrases that slip out in moments of discomfort, pressure, or quiet insecurity. We tell ourselves they are harmless. We tell ourselves they are honest. But in truth, they are admissions. Not of truth, but of surrender. And every time we say them, we loosen our grip on ourselves. Strength is not something we perform in front of others. It is something we either hold or we don't. And language, our language, reveals this instantly. Before our actions are judged, before our results are measured, the words we choose expose the condition of our inner world. They betray whether we command ourselves or whether we are still at the mercy of circumstance, emotion, and fear. There is one phrase in particular that must be abandoned, completely, without hesitation, because it sounds harmless, but it signals weakness in its purest form. Not weakness of body, but weakness of discipline, weakness of control, weakness of thought. And once it becomes habit, it begins to shape the entire direction of a life. We are here to remove it, not just from speech, but from thought itself. 1. I can't. We say it quickly, almost automatically. I can't do this. I can't handle this. I can't deal with this right now. It feels like a statement of limitation, but it is actually a declaration of surrender. The moment those words leave us, we have already stepped away from the fight. Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." And yet when we say, "I can't," we remove ourselves from reaction entirely. We pretend the situation itself has defeated us, when in truth we have chosen not to engage with it. There is a subtle comfort in saying, "I can't." It frees us from responsibility. It allows us to avoid discomfort without feeling weak. But that comfort is deceptive. Because every time we say it, we reinforce the idea that we are governed by circumstances rather than by choice. We begin to believe it, and belief becomes identity. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Notice the precision of that statement. Power exists, but only within. The moment we say "I can't," we deny that power exists at all, and this is where the damage begins. Not in the failure to act, but in the acceptance of powerlessness. Because once a man believes he cannot act, he stops trying. And once he stops trying, he slowly becomes the very thing he fears, incapable. So we replace it, not with arrogance, not with false confidence, but with truth. I will find a way. I will endure this. I will face it, whether I like it or not. Because the reality is, most of what we say we can't do, we simply don't want to endure. 2. It's not my fault. This phrase is even more dangerous, because it hides behind reason, behind logic, behind what appears to be fairness. And often, it is true. It may not be our fault. The situation may be unjust. The circumstances may be outside our control. But none of that matters, because the moment we say those words, we shift our focus away from what we can control and place it entirely on what we cannot. Seneca warned, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. But we suffer even more when we fixate on blame. When we replay events in our minds, trying to assign responsibility, we trap ourselves in a loop of helplessness. Blame is a comfortable prison. As if it's not our fault, then we don't have to act. We don't have to adapt. We don't have to grow. We can remain exactly where we are and justify it. But growth has never come from justification. It comes from ownership. Even when it isn't our fault, it is still our responsibility. Responsibility to respond. Responsibility to adjust. Responsibility to move forward without waiting for fairness or apology. Because life does not pause for justice. It continues regardless. Epictetus again reminds us, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. That is the discipline. That is the line we walk. We do not waste energy proving we were wronged. We use that energy to become unshakable. 3. I'll do it later. This one feels harmless, almost innocent, but it is the quiet architect of mediocrity. I'll start tomorrow. I'll handle it later. I'll get to it when I have more time. These words do not sound like weakness, but they are the language of avoidance. And avoidance, repeated long enough, becomes identity. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." There is urgency in that thought, not panic, but clarity. The understanding that time is not something we possess, it is something we are losing. Every time we delay action, we gamble with time we do not control, and yet we act as if later is guaranteed. But later is a myth we tell ourselves to make inaction feel acceptable. The truth is, action is always uncomfortable. There will never be a perfect moment. There will never be a moment where effort feels effortless. And so later becomes the excuse we hide behind to avoid confronting that discomfort. But discipline does not negotiate with comfort. It acts anyway. We replace, "I'll do it later," with something far more honest. "I will do it now, even if I don't feel ready." Because readiness is not a prerequisite for action. Action is what creates readiness. 4. I'm just like this. This phrase is the most dangerous of all, because it disguises itself as identity. I'm just not disciplined. I'm just not confident. I'm just not built for this. These are not observations, they are decisions. When we say, "I'm just like this," we are not describing who we are. We are defining who we refuse to become. We draw a line around ourselves and declare that growth will not cross it. But there is nothing fixed about us. Seneca believed deeply in the malleability of character. He wrote extensively about training the mind, reshaping habits, and confronting internal weakness through deliberate practice. To claim we are just like this is to reject that entire process. It is to choose stagnation. And stagnation is not neutral, it is decay. Every day we remain the same. We are not preserving ourselves. We are slowly eroding our potential because life continues to demand more, whether we are prepared or not. So we abandon that phrase entirely. We replace it with, "I am becoming someone stronger," because identity is not something we discover. It is something we build. And every action either strengthens that structure or weakens it. 5. I don't feel like it. This is the phrase that destroys consistency, because feelings are powerful, immediate, convincing. When we don't feel like doing something, it feels justified to stop, to rest, to delay. But feelings are not commands. They are signals, and most of the time, they are signals of resistance, not inability. Marcus Aurelius captured this perfectly. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, "I have to go to work," as a human being. There is no negotiation in that statement, no consideration of mood or comfort, only duty. Because discipline is not built on feeling, it is built on decision. If we only act when we feel like it, we become slaves to emotional fluctuation. One day we move forward, the next we fall back, and over time progress becomes inconsistent, fragile. But when we act regardless of feeling, something changes. We begin to trust ourselves. We begin to understand that we are not governed by emotion. We are guided by principle. And that is where real strength emerges. So we stop saying, "I don't feel like it," and we start saying, "It doesn't matter how I feel, I will do it anyway." Because the moment we detach action from emotion, we gain control. There are many ways to appear strong, but there is only one way to become it. And it begins in silence. In the quiet moments where no one is watching, where no one is judging, where there is no performance, only choice. The words we speak in those moments matter more than anything else, because they shape the way we think, and the way we think shapes the way we live. We do not need louder motivation. We do not need external validation. We need discipline in thought. We need precision in language. We need to remove the phrases that weaken us and replace them with ones that demand more, not from others, but from ourselves. There is a story about Epictetus that cuts deeper than any theory ever could. Before he became known for his teachings, he was a slave. At one point, his master twisted his leg with such force that it was clear it would break. And Epictetus calmly said, "If you continue, you will break it." The man continued, and the leg snapped. Epictetus simply looked at him and said, "I told you." No rage, no panic, no, "I can't." Just clarity, just acceptance, just control. In that moment, his body was overpowered, but his mind remained completely untouched. That is what it looks like when a man refuses to surrender internally, no matter what is happening externally. We like to think strength shows up in big moments, in battle, in crisis, but most of the time it shows up in smaller, quieter decisions, like when Marcus Aurelius sat in a war tent surrounded by chaos, betrayal, and constant pressure, and still wrote reminders to himself about patience, discipline, and restraint. He was the most powerful man in the world, and yet his greatest concern was not controlling others, but controlling himself. Imagine that. With armies at his command, he still woke up reminding himself not to complain, not to blame, not to give in to anger. That alone tells you everything about where true power lies. There's another moment, less dramatic, but just as revealing. A man wakes up early, tired, irritated, not wanting to move. The bed feels heavier than usual. The day feels pointless. And the first thought that comes to mind is, "I don't feel like it." This is where most people lose. Not in failure, but in hesitation. This is where discipline is decided, because nothing external is forcing him to stay. It's his own thoughts holding him there, but if he follows the path laid out by those who mastered themselves, he interrupts it. He replaces that thought immediately. He stands up anyway, and that one small act begins to reshape who he is. Seneca once wrote about deliberately practicing discomfort, taking cold baths, eating simple food, wearing rough clothing. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to remind himself that he could endure, that he did not need luxury, that he was not fragile. We live in a time where comfort is constant, yet resilience is rare, and that's not a coincidence. When everything is easy, the mind becomes soft. It begins to believe that anything difficult is unbearable, and so when real hardship comes, the first instinct is to say, "I can't." But that instinct is trained, and anything trained can be untrained. Think about the person who constantly says, "It's not my fault." At first it sounds reasonable. They were treated unfairly, they were put in a bad position. But watch what happens over time. They stay in the same place, same habits, same frustrations, because they've built an identity around being wronged instead of being responsible. Meanwhile, someone else in the exact same situation decides to take ownership, not because it's fair, but because it's effective. And slowly that person begins to move forward, not because life treated them better, but because they refused to stay stuck explaining why they couldn't. There's a harsh truth most people avoid. Nobody is coming to fix anything for us. Not consistently, not reliably. And the sooner we accept that, the more power we regain. Epictetus made this painfully clear when he said we must stop seeking for things to happen as we wish, and instead wish for things to happen as they do. That's not passive. That's adaptive. It means we stop wasting energy arguing with reality and start working with it. And once that shift happens, the phrase, "It's not my fault," becomes irrelevant. Because fault no longer matters. Only response does. There's also the slow poison of, "I'll do it later." You don't notice it at first. It feels harmless. You skip one workout, delay one task, push one responsibility to tomorrow. But those moments compound. Days become weeks, weeks become months, and eventually you look around and realize nothing has changed. Not because you weren't capable, but because you kept postponing action. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself of death, not out of fear, but to sharpen urgency. Because when you truly understand that time is limited, later starts to feel like a dangerous gamble, rather than a harmless delay. Picture two people standing at the same starting point, same goal, same resources. One says, "I'll start tomorrow." The other starts immediately, even if it's messy, even if it's imperfect. Fast forward 6 months. The difference is massive, not because one was more talented, but because one respected time, and the other assumed it would always be there. That's how lives separate, quietly, gradually, without any dramatic moment, just a series of small decisions repeated daily. Then there's identity, the most powerful force of all. When someone says, "I'm just like this," they've already decided their future, because they've removed the possibility of change. And once change is off the table, effort becomes meaningless. Why try if nothing will be different? But the reality is, every trait we claim as fixed was built through repetition. Habits, thoughts, reactions, all reinforced over time, which means they can be rebuilt the same way, if we're willing to confront the discomfort of doing so. There's a story of a man who believed he was naturally undisciplined. Always late, always inconsistent, always distracted. He repeated that identity for years, until one day he stopped saying it, not because he believed it was false, but because he realized it was useless. He replaced it with action instead, showing up on time even when he didn't feel like it, finishing tasks even when he wanted to quit. And over time, something shifted. Not instantly, but gradually. Until one day the old identity no longer matched reality. That's how transformation actually happens. Not through belief, but through repeated contradiction of the old self. And then we come back to feeling, the most deceptive force we deal with, because it feels so real, so convincing. When we're tired, we feel like we can't continue. When we're overwhelmed, we feel like we need to stop. But feelings are temporary. They rise and fall constantly. If we build our actions around them, we become unstable, inconsistent, reactive. But if we learn to observe them without obeying them, we gain something rare: stability. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this constantly, about separating perception from reality, about not letting emotion dictate action. He didn't eliminate emotion, he mastered his response to it. And that's the difference. We're not trying to become emotionless, we're trying to become unshaken by emotion. Imagine a man standing in the rain. Cold, uncomfortable. Everything in him says to go inside, to quit, to stop. But he stays. Not because he enjoys it, but because he's training something deeper than comfort. He's proving to himself that his actions are not dictated by his environment, and that proof builds confidence. Not the loud kind, but the quiet, unbreakable kind. Because at the end of all this, that's what we're really building. Not motivation, not hype, not temporary bursts of energy. Control. Control over thought, control over speech, control over action. And once we have that, everything changes. Not because life becomes easier, but because we become harder to break.